All right. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 12. I talk to myself all the time, so it won't be that different for me really in this way. So.
I answer myself.
They tell me I should be concerned when I do, but I just don't worry about it. No, all right. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 12, Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason you also be glad and rejoice with me." And so, picking up here in this section of Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, we are picking up with Paul dealing with conflict in the church. And, he's skipping ahead to chapter 4 when he talks about these two people, Yodia and Syntyche, who have some kind of conflict. And that seems to be impacting the congregation. And he says, conflict is going to happen. That's just a part of being close to people. It's a part of being a family. But we do need to grow in our response to conflict, and that there is a mature way to respond to it, and that's deeply tied up with the idea of joy that is so prevalent throughout the book and also in this section. And so he has started in chapter 1, and he's given us sort of these basic principles of maturity, especially in time of conflict, that have a lot to do with trying to see the bigger picture, what's really important here. And especially chapter 1 and verse 27, when he says, "Let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ," that there is a bigger picture here. And then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, he has described what that really looks like. But he has continued then to give us 4 examples that help to illustrate what it looks like, so we have better clarity. And so verses 5 through 11, he used Christ as the primary example, and how Christ emptied himself because he could meet a need for us that we could not meet for ourselves. But here in chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, he's going to pick up and he's going to use himself as an example. And so he's going to kind of describe some things about them and about how he thinks about them, so that, and then toward the end, what he's going through for them, so that they can kind of see that he has done this for them, and that they can follow in that path. So he starts in verse 12, and he says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed." And whenever you see the word "therefore," you're thinking he's going to draw some kind of conclusion. That's what that generally means, is what I've said before. Now I'm going to explain that in more detail. And he says, "As you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Now, when you look at this verse, what would you say really is sort of the emphasis? What is he really trying to emphasize with his word choice and kind of what's repeated here in chapter 2 and verse 12? Yes, I do. I think that really kind of what you said there, he's emphasizing your own. But a lot of times, don't we have a tendency to kind of work on other people's salvation, at least in our minds,
More fun.
It's more fun. I agree. I do, well, what he needs or what she needs or what that person needs to do, or, it's sometimes very easy for us to see how other people need to grow and change. And a lot of times the root of conflict is there's some differing opinion or some action that you've taken, and all I can see is what you have done wrong, what you should be doing about it, and I forget to stop and check in with me. And so there's this sort of emphasis here, work out not that person's salvation, work out your own salvation. And he adds to that, it's interesting, isn't it, with fear and with trembling. And so as we consider obeying Christ in the way that Paul obeyed Christ, you can kind of see this attitude here that really quite frankly, the world at large doesn't like to admit about our attitude toward God, and that is, that involved with worship and obedience to God is the idea that we don't forget who he is, and that, he's not just another person, but he's something more than that. And that while certainly he wants our salvation, and he has done everything possible to make that available to us, at the end of the day, he is the judge of all the earth, and he will do what's right as far as judging our souls in the end. And that there's no get out of jail free cards as far as he's given us grace and a path to salvation, but we have our part to play in that. And that if we forget that, we can begin to kind of take that for granted. And so, as Miss Linda said, the idea here is kind of, no matter who is watching, that what we're working on is a consistent faith, that we're working on believing in God in such a way that our actions become over time more and more consistent day in and day out, and that they don't change dramatically depending on who is in our presence, right? Have you ever done that? Have you known people who do that? And when they're with this group of people, they act one way, and then they're on Sunday morning, they act a different way, and then at work, they act a third way, and they kind of blend and change with every group that they're with. We can do that privately in our own lives as far as our faith is stronger, you might say, or at least we are putting on a show maybe sometimes around people but alone, or around certain people. And you think about this situation, what really is probably happening here is, if you remember from chapter 3, he's talking about how these Judaizing teachers, they keep trying to get people to follow the law of Moses, to get circumcised and all those things. And he's saying, it's funny, they don't talk about those things when I'm there, right? For some reason, at the potluck luncheons, nobody is arguing about this when I'm at the potluck luncheon, or nobody's preaching on it on Sunday when I'm there. But when I'm not there, and especially now that I'm in prison, remember back in chapter 1, starting in verse 14, he says, most of the brethren, chapter 1:14, most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some are preaching it from envy and strife, and some from goodwill. And so he said, some of them are now preaching more often, and they're doing it for the wrong reasons. And he kind of implies throughout this with this intention of growing to a place where people trust them, so that they can teach their own theories about things, their own doctrines about things. And so, it's, well, when I'm not there, everything is different. But a consistent faith isn't changing based on who's present and who's not present. That's, I think those congregations, and they have small groups on Sunday evenings. Sometimes they go to different people's homes, and technically I think there's nothing wrong with that. I can find, sort of a scriptural argument for it. But my concern with small groups, and this is just personally, my concern with small groups is that it creates a situation where you're taking the church and you're dividing it into different homes, where suddenly, unless you just have a bukus of elders, there's not a lot of leadership and guidance over each group of them. Yeah, oversight. And this is, you can look at the statistics. Normally when a Church of Christ begins to have small groups on Sunday evenings, within a few years they have split. That's just normally how it goes. That's part of the reason why I feel the way I do about it. That's normally the way it goes, and it's because you get into these small groups, and suddenly people are teaching things that they wouldn't dare teach in the church building, where the elders could hear about it, or the deacons could hear about it, or whatever, but they're fine teaching it in their homes to small groups of people. And so suddenly you really start to have this congregation, and that congregation, and that congregation, and then they eventually turn into different congregations, because at church they're one way, at home they teach something else. That's a little bit about what he's talking about here. And so he says, no matter who is watching, he says, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence. Work out your own salvation. And as we said, I'm not focused on your changes. I'm focused on my changes. And so, especially if you're talking about doctrinal matters, like I think he is here, this is not, you and I have a disagreement about, what we believe on something. not to the point that we can't worship together anymore, but just we believe different things about a certain issue. And what we tend to do is, I'm going to convince them, right? I'm going to make them see it from how I think it should be. And it's, maybe I need to go back and make sure that I'm firm in what I believe and give them some time to work out what they believe about this too, trusting that God in His providence can bring us to the same place if we're both being really honest.
We have this human need to be right.
Sure.
Always be right.
Yeah, I think there is the need to be right stems from a sense of insecurity and fear that if I'm wrong, what else am I wrong about? Where does that end? You know, and it just goes on, and suddenly my whole life is, you know, not what I thought it was. But you know, I can't remember. I think it was John Hafner when he was here last summer for the summer series. He said, "Truth is not afraid of." Maybe he said scrutiny or questions or. Truth is not afraid to just present itself and then have someone cross-examine and answer those questions, because at the end of the day, truth is always the same.
Tells us to question.
It's a question, that's right, yeah. Which means sometimes we're going to be questioning what each other says. There has to be space for that without, you know, separating and to be working these things out and not all be in the exact same place all the time. Yes, Miss Faye?
You know, of course, Paul loves these people.
Yes.
He's been with them, and he wants to know that they're strong enough, that they've worked out their salvation, and they're strong enough, whether he's there or not, if somebody comes along and they're trying to teach them something else, they're strong enough.
They know.
To disregard that.
That's right. Yeah.
And follow what's right.
To have a little bit of confidence in what you've studied and believed for yourself, that you know what you believe, and that you would change if you found that what you believe is wrong, but that you don't have to doubt that just because someone else has a different idea. Yes, Mr. David.
Well, it says in the Bible that you don't correct a fool because he'll hate you.
Sure.
It also says that if you correct a wise man, he doesn't mind because he's actually seeking the truth.
That's right.
Not being right.
Not being right.
And when people correct me, if I get mad, I say, well, I'm an idiot.
Yeah. You know, I think you're right about that. I think you are right in what you're saying, though. Yeah, that the Book of Proverbs has a lot to say about this. Yes, sir. There's no conflict here, is there? No, yeah. The Book of Proverbs has a lot to say about this very concept, and I appreciate you bringing that out. That there is certainly a time and a place to correct people, and there's a time and a place not to, even if you know they're wrong. Just because they're wrong right now doesn't mean you need to say something right now. And there's a kind of a way to go about that. And there's a way about first checking in with yourself and saying, why am I correcting them? And how sure am I that I'm right? Or is it really just that I'm angry or insecure that I want to correct them? Yes?
I just want to say what you were saying about this splitting up into small groups like on Sunday nights, like some of the congregations are doing. It's so dangerous because I've actually witnessed that personally.
Sure.
I was actually in a situation where an individual came in and his sole purpose was to get off in these small groups so he could teach his ideas.
Yeah.
And try to
Yeah.
pass away.
All right, and I'm not saying that every congregation that does it is wrong to do it necessarily, but I just think that it's very, there must be a really good reason, very good scriptural reason, with really strong leadership in that congregation if it's not going to end in disaster, because 9 times out of 10, I think it does. And I wonder sometimes about the ones that happen if they aren't just not there at disaster yet, you know. So not that anyone's been talking about that here, it's just an example, but yeah, I think I appreciate that kind of the firsthand of what we're looking at. It can be very dangerous. But so then, as we continue, he says that you're working out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. And so, you know, I think we have to be just a little bit careful with how we treat this verse, because I think you can get the wrong idea from it if you aren't kind of thinking through the whole section as you're looking at it. But what he's saying here, I think, is your reason is for God. You know, it's God who works in you to will and to do for his good pleasure. Right? The reason for what we're doing is for God. And especially in conflict, if you remember, this is not about getting what I want, this is about getting his will done. If it's about his will, that changes our perspective very rapidly, I think. And so, and then he says it's through God. But again, being careful about how we explain what it means that it's through God that we are, he works to do his, for us to do, to will and to do, I can't say that, who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. And so he is saying, God works in you so that he changes your will, right? That's your desire, what you want. And he changes your actions there. If you change the will, you change the actions. And so again, the book of Philippians is very much about the thought. It starts with your thoughts. If you are thinking the right things, you will desire the right things. If you're desiring the right things, you will more naturally do the right things. And so it's a lot about what's happening in your mind as kind of a battlefield. And he says that God works in you. But be careful there, and don't forget about verse 12. What does verse 12 say about what we do?
Well, you're talking about working out with your own salvation, with fear and trembling.
That we're doing some work too,
Right.
right? And so to say that God works in you isn't what a lot of people would claim, that, once you're saved in some way that God just sort of like takes over and just sort of like makes you what he wants you to be, and that, there's almost like there's no free will to a degree. He's not saying that, in a moment of temptation, God's going to like possess you and keep you from sinning, right? That we are working out our own salvation. And he says that's with fear. And so, that's the word that it's the word phobos, where we get our word phobia from. And so, you think a phobia is, it's not just a respect, it's a real literal kind of, I'm terrified of something, to a degree that I would do anything to get away from whatever that is. And that if we have a fear of missing heaven, of sin, if we're terrified of that, then we'll do anything we can to get away from sin, away from hell, so forth. And then he says trembling. Trembling is the idea literally of to quiver or to quake with fear. And so have you ever like something happened and you were just so afraid that your whole body just shook, you kind of felt yourself almost shut down and you're just still shaking, you get in a car wreck and then once you get out and you start to kind of think about what happened, you just sort of, or something like that. That's the idea here, that when we think about missing our salvation, it causes us to quiver. It causes us to I do not want to miss salvation. And so, that while the Christian walk is one of confidence, it's not about doubting your salvation. That's what 1 John is about. It's one where we don't forget that we can lose it. And I think that's what he's getting at here is, don't forget that it can be lost. Not that you should doubt whether you have it. You can know if you have it or not, and therefore what you should do. And it's not one where we go around and we're constantly just terrified to do anything. It's remembering that you can lose it, and that should impact you emotionally so that it impacts your will and your actions. Miss Faith?
If you have that godly fear, which you need,
Mm-hmm.
surfacing when something that is in error does come along, you really look at it closely, you examine it
Yes.
with fear to be sure that you're doing the right thing.
Well, I think really, yeah, it's as you're examining those things, you're thinking, I think that I could, go talk to that person and argue my case, but wouldn't it be terrible if I were wrong? That you're not going to go argue that case until you just feel as certain as you can.
Well, I'm thinking of doctrine.
That's what I'm saying too, yeah. Right. That these people who are teaching you have to get circumcised to be obedient to God, they're sort of couching their faith in what they were raised to believe, but not what they were being taught now. And he says, if you persist in this teaching and convincing other people to do that, you should be terrified about that, and that some part of your conscience is telling you this doesn't quite match up, and I need to go back and really just study it out before I teach it anymore, and make sure that it's right. That when we stand up to say something, whether that's from a pulpit or just individually together, that we are not just saying. I can't remember who, I do remember who now. But I was having a conversation this morning with someone who was talking about people who say their opinion about something as if it's fact, and it's just like, I know this is what you need to do, when you know that they're wrong, and that they're standing up and they're saying, I know that you must be circumcised in order to have salvation. Paul says you're wrong, but if they had a proper fear and trembling of that, then they would have sat down and studied a lot harder and realized they were wrong before they taught it. And so it's, not that we can't just discuss things sometimes and say, I'm not sure about this, what do you think about that? But that's a discussion. That's much different than saying, I know that this is what God said. We should be, in a sense, terrified to say, God says this, unless we've really studied it out to the point where we feel confident about that. And always you kind of hold this kind of odd balance between being confident in what you believe and always open to consider that maybe you are wrong, to consider it. But just because you're willing to consider that you're wrong doesn't mean that you aren't sure, confident in what you believe until you have a reason to doubt it, right? And you're kind of having both at the same time. It's a little bit of an odd place to be, but that's what true honesty is confident that what I've studied is true, but willing to consider, if someone presents evidence, how that plays into what I believe. And if it requires to change what I believe or do, then I do that. But confident that if it doesn't, I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing. And that's kind of an odd place. But when we get that out of line, we either become unconfident and therefore we don't do anything because we don't have the faith to believe what we believe, not truly, or we are not willing to consider the evidence of someone else bringing to ask the question, well, could that be true or not? And therefore become blind to it and become proud and stuck in one track. So any thoughts about that before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
My thought is those that were raised being taught one way. If you look at like the Old Testament where he's taught circumcision, then Christ comes in and he's taught the new law.
Yes.
Many probably didn't want to let go of that.
Sure.
Their fathers had that, and it was carried, down from generation to generation. But now it's completely letting go of all of that teaching. So it's even harder to ingrain it into their belief.
Sure. Well, I think you do see a parallel of that in two ways, really, because you have those who were not raised in the church, and there's many of us here who realized that what we learned as a child was not right and had to sort of let that go. And that's what keeps a lot of people from accepting the truth. But even for people who are raised in the church, I find most people that I talk to, they find that there was at least something, at least one, not always a big thing, but something that their parents or their childhood preacher or someone taught them that they realized doesn't really line up with what the Bible says. And so it doesn't matter what our background is, we always could find, maybe even it could be a minor belief, not something that's life-changing, but could find something life-changing. That is always possible. And so we have to keep that open so we'll consider the evidence, while simultaneously being confident that what we believe is the likeliest to be true because we've done our best to reason through it. And that's, when he says work out, the word for work out there is literally the idea to press down very hard on something, and they would use it to mean to work to exhaustion. They would use it when they describe, I've been out, building a building, I've been cutting stone all day long, and I'm just dead beat tired. And so this is, there's no limit to how hard we are working to understand the Bible and to be sure that what we believe is true. And again, it doesn't mean that we are reserving judgment till judgment day, right? The Bible says something and we can understand it. But it just means if there's any seed of doubt there, we've got to sit down and figure that out and not be teaching people things that we aren't confident are true, as confident as is reasonable. All right, so that line, am I just butchering how to explain that line?
I like what you used. The Old Testament laws was God's law.
That's right.
And there's a lot of things that people were taught, like you said, was younger. It wasn't necessarily, it was a misunderstanding what God's had us do. But those people that were Jews that had to change to Christianity and change different to what Christ wanted them to know.
Right.
That was God's law at one time.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It was there.
Right.
And they had a very difficult, and I can understand
Sure.
now why they had a difficult
Sure.
time changing over to something that they don't see as God's law
Right.
until they realize who Christ
Right.
was.
Yeah, and you think if the Jews who had very legitimate beliefs, because at one time that was what God required,
Right.
then had to change their entire belief system, really, Christ says he's fulfilled the law, and so this is really just an extenuation. This is what God always intended, but practically speaking, to have to make so many changes because they had to be open to the fact that maybe things are changing and that what they once believed is no longer true. If they had to do that, it's completely reasonable then for us to have to do the same thing when what we once believed was not true in the
Well, I would
first
say it was
place.
no longer true.
Well,
It was no longer in effect.
in effect, thank you, yeah. GW?
I like the way you said that too, Johnny. It's still affecting us today.
Sure.
What we believe in church.
Sure.
Because a lot of people right now, they still haven't let go of the old law.
Oh, sure.
Especially, on some of the things like instruments in the church.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say, well, David, he played the harp,
That's true.
this and that, so it's still hard.
Really,
And
I think
can really understand those people.
that's true.
Day one, it changed.
I like that I really think 99% of people in what we call Christian churches today believe that we are still bound at least to the Ten Commandments, if not parts of the old law. And they don't understand that if you obey a part of the old law, you have to obey the whole thing and do all of that. And so I think that's a good point, that even still we are fighting letting go of the old law. Yes, sir.
My wife and I talked about that a lot, that people still wanna hang on to the old law, and they still would have to keep it to the letter,
Sure.
but even still, it wouldn't save them,
No,
because they had to have that perfect sacrifice of Christ first.
that's right. Well, and really, it's kind of interesting when you think about practicing Judaism, either in part or in whole today, is you actually can't practice it in whole anymore. Because what God did when he destroyed the temple in AD 70 was he destroyed the record of the priest, and you have to have a priest to be able to connect with God in Judaism. And they destroyed all of the holy things in the temple itself. Their whole way of connecting with God is gone. And so you can't practice it in whole today. And it's kind of interesting. That was not the case when he wrote the book of Philippians, which you can see why it was more confusing then, because you could still go to the temple and practice, but it's not true anymore. So, yes, sir.
So one thing about old law and new law is the old law is not abolished. The old law changed when Christ came because he fulfilled it. Well, with him fulfilling it, it's still the same law.
Right.
It's just the procedure of the law has changed.
Right. Yeah. And in effect, that's true as far as God hasn't changed, and what God wants hasn't changed in any possible way. But the details of how to fulfill it have changed.
And
Yeah.
Christ explained it that even with the old law, it wasn't so much a law as an example of what the law is going to be. It
would become that
your
anyway.
sacrifices and stuff like that. That was an example. More
That's right.
So than
Yes, really, all those
law.
things you read about in the old law, while they were a law for those people, the bigger picture thing is they're
They
a
have rights
picture. Yeah, they're a picture of what we do now,
Right.
so that we can visualize spiritual things through a physical action. Yeah. And so, while we say abolished, what we really mean is we don't observe the old law. We don't do those things anymore. But yeah, it was fulfilled, and so yeah, that's a good distinction.
It had a definite beginning and an end.
Right.
It wouldn't have been nailed on the cross.
That's right. Yeah, and even the idea that it has a definite beginning shows that it was not intended to be forever.
I'd like to ask a personal question, if you don't mind me asking. The conflict that you had in yourself when you had to make that decision of how you were raised and then how you became a member of Christ Church, what kind of conflict was that for you? Because I was raised in the church. I don't have that example. I don't have that understanding that people I know that we ask to come from, even if you talk about Buddhism or Catholicism or any of those other big religions, how difficult it is to change.
Well, I think it's different for every person, but for me, really, growing up, at least by the time that I was in middle school, we were going to a denomination, and I would ask lots of questions and found the answers were very vague and unanswered. And being a kid, I didn't know what to do about that, so I just sort of accepted it. But when I started going to the Church of Christ, and I went with Sarah when we started dating, at first it was very angering to me, the things that the preacher would say. I was very upset by what he said, because it didn't match what I was grown to believe. But what I eventually discovered, I would go home and I would open my Bible and I was going to prove him wrong. He is just a pompous jerk. He has no idea what he's talking about, and I know that that's not what the Bible says. But what I discovered was that A, he did know what he was talking about, and that generally speaking the church does, and B, that he was actually answering all the questions that I was asking as a kid that the denomination that I was a part of was leaving very vague because they didn't know the answers to them. And so as I began to discover that, I sat down and I studied with them. And truth be told, I knew what I needed to do for several months before I did it. And the conflict that I had, as you're asking about, was really just I had a hard time accepting the reality of there being one true church and what that means for the rest of the world. And that was very difficult for me to accept. But one day I think I was airing up my tire and it just sort of hit me because I was trying not to think about it. It just kept kind of coming back into my mind and it just kind of kept circling and I couldn't stop thinking about it even though I wanted to. And I realized for the rest of my life, however long that is, I'm just going to keep thinking about this and I'm just going to keep thinking about this. And if I put it off forever, I'm just going to be miserable thinking about this and I don't do anybody any good. But if I just do what I know the Bible is telling me to do, then at least maybe I have the opportunity for somebody else to see that example, and this is what God says I need to do, and so why put it off any longer?
The reason I ask that is because when we work with people and talk with people and try to teach them what's right, we sometimes I don't have a basis to come from on how difficult a decision these people are going to have to make.
Well, I think, like I said, it's different for everyone, but I think some of it is the comfort of what you were grown to believe, what you were raised to believe. It's hard to let go of that blanket. And some of it, I think, is very much emotional. Of just, I just didn't want it to be true for a while, and I had a hard time accepting the reality of it.
Go back to this time period. These people have the same
problem. Issue.
They had that blanket of what they had all their generations have always believed in.
Yeah.
And now it's changed on them.
That's right. Yeah, and so that does help us kind of put ourselves maybe in their perspective. So he picks up in verse 14 then, and he says, "Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation." So I think this is interesting, and this is kind of the question I think it raises is, what? Because there is a natural connection between what he says in verse 13 and what he says in verse 14, but why place verse 14 specifically after verses 12 and 13? What reason would he put it in that place particularly? What connection do those verses have? And I think what you're looking at there is, in essence, Paul is expanding on chapter 2 in verse 11. Remember in verse 11, he says, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. Verse 10, he said, every knee will bow, all those knees. And that is kind of expanding on this idea that there is supposed to be this unity, especially in the church, that we're all growing to the same place. And so he says, if you are focused on you and working out your own salvation, and you're less focused on what the person that you're angry at is doing wrong or what you think that they're doing wrong, then the response to that is that you will do all these things without complaining or disputing. And so he's continuing his thought on conflict and how to work out conflict in a mature way. To complain is a very general word, just means kind of like to grumble. It brings up the idea of the people in the book of Numbers. To dispute is the idea of really just to think something through internally or to debate something externally. But the Bible always uses that word negatively, and so I think it kind of adds to it the idea that you are sort of, you're debating with the wrong motive, that you're just trying to prove yourself right in essence. And so he says, in whatever you're doing, even if there's conflict, you cannot be grumbling about the conflict or the person, because that never creates a situation where good things happen. And we're not going to be disputing or debating things that are of opinion, things that are just my way to do things, things that are, trying to get things to lean in my direction. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't debate doctrinal issues together, in the correct manner to come to the same conclusion, to study together. But when it comes to these kind of matters of opinion, we're willing to let those go. We're not going to get into long, drawn-out arguments about why it should be my way or why it should be your way, because that's not what's important at the end of the day. And so he instructs us to put really, if we have a consistent faith, then the point of that is going to bring God glory, which is what verses 10 and 11 are about. And peace and unity is what brings God's glory, So verse 14 is getting to that, how do we bring God this glory that he deserves where every knee bows? Our peace and unity is the path forward. Miss Linda.
Well, I'm applying this verse 15 to today, that you may be blameless and harmless. We are in the midst of a crooked and perverse
Sure.
nation today.
Yes, ma'am.
But in spite of all that, we're to be found blameless and harmless and be lights that shine in the world.
That's right. That we have. That's the bigger picture. And when we, you think, if we're debating over insignificant things, right? Romans 14:1 talks about Romans 14:1. I'll just read it because it's clearer that way. Romans 14:1, he says, "Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things," right? That we extend fellowship to brothers and sisters in Christ who maybe don't understand things as well as we do, but we're not going to spend all of our time disputing and arguing over things with those people. And if it gets to the point where that's all they want to talk about, then we have a church discipline sort of situation going on. And so, we're not receiving people to disputes over doubtful, or in other words, insignificant things. And then likewise, 1 Timothy 2 and Titus 1 both describe what our disputes look like. And he says, we're not going to spend our time debating genealogies. That's a Jewish thing. We're not going to spend our time debating, all of these pointless, insignificant things. Or we're not going to spend our time debating selfish things. And you think about James chapter 2 and verse 4. That congregation was debating how to treat rich people and poor people. That was all about selfishness. That was all about, setting ourselves up for financial success. And he says, we're not going to spend our time on those things. That's not what's important. Back to chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. This is what's important. Our peace and unity bring God glory, and that's what Miss Linda's getting at. That's what influences others as well. And so, it's kind of interesting because didn't in verse 13 he just tell us to work out our own salvation, right? Focus on yourself. But now in verse 15 he's talking about influencing other people. And so why focus on others now in verse 15 when we're supposed to be focusing on ourselves in verse 13?
Aren't we still focusing on ourselves, and that's what's convincing the other people?
I think that's exactly it. So often our evangelism is about how you need to change and what you need to do, and what do I know that can help you? But if we're just focused on working out my own salvation, other people will just see. And so when we have the opportunity to say something to them, they'll be more likely to listen. Or even if we don't have the opportunity to say something, we are, as he says, lights in the world. That's really interesting. He says you shine as lights. Lights is literally the word that they use for the stars. And so you could say shine as stars. And then in the world, sometimes it's translated world, sometimes it's translated universe. And so when you go outside at night, if there are no clouds, you just can't help but notice the stars. I know today in big cities it's harder to see them, but even in the big cities, you can still see stars. At nighttime, you can't help but see them because they shine so bright. And when we have that peace and unity, that's what we are like. People, now they might ignore it, they might choose to cover it up, they might not listen to it, but they can't help but see something about it that should draw them in. You think that's what stars do? They're beautiful. And so they draw you in. People have spent their lives studying stars because they're so fascinating, to discover how, and then as they've studied it, they discovered that stars and planets all move in such an orderly fashion, and it's all just so magnificent and beautiful, and the science of it is amazing. And that's how a lot of people have come to discover that there is a God in the first place. And that's what Romans 1 describes. Just by looking at those stars, if you think about it hard enough, you will discover there must be a creator of that. That's what we are. When people look at us and our peace and our unity, even in the middle of conflict, if they are inspired by that, as they should be, then they will study that, they'll think about that, and they'll realize there is something real. There's a real power behind what they do. There is a real God behind the works that those people are doing, that we are inviting people to consider us so that they can see God when they peel back the layers of who we are. But that only comes if we're doing that. He says harmless. Harmless is the idea of innocent, and that means you've never sinned, but just that you are you're growing to a place where when it comes to sinful things, you know less about them or spend less time in them, and so people can't look at you and say, well, there's a sin-ridden person. You're innocent. He says, without fault. And so that's really the idea that nobody can censor you, which censor is, like to rebuke you. No one can point at you and say, this guy, everybody knows that this guy cheats everybody when he collects rent every month, or whatever it is. Nobody can point to you and say, there's this one thing that this guy does wrong, that generally you're trying to overcome sin and you're succeeding. And he says, without fault. And so, we covered that one. Harmless and without fault. Blameless, I'm sorry, that's the one we missed. He says that you're blameless. And so that's the idea. It's the opposite of crooked. Blameless is like up straight. Crooked is literally the word scolios, right? We know that word from scoliosis. And so it's a crooked back. Perverse is a twisted, right? It's where you're taking someone's back and you just twist it up in knots. And so they go from straight to crooked. That's uncomfortable. It's not healthy. It's not good. To twisted. And that's the generation. But God is the one who can untwist and straighten a person who was once in there, as many of us are proof of. Miss Faye?
I just want to say, when you were talking about the lights and the stars and being the light,
Mm-hmm.
we just need to live so that people say, I want that.
Yes, I think that's exactly,
That.
yeah. And it's not just individual, but when they look at the church, they say, there's just something different and special about them that I don't quite understand, but I want to know more about. It draws people in. I think that's exactly it. And so then he continues in verse 16, and he says, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. And so we are bringing God glory through our peace and unity, and therefore influencing others for the eternal. That we are doing this so that other people are impacted, not just in this life, but into the next life. If we are blameless and harmless and without fault, then what comes is we obey God consistently, and that's really what he's getting at. Consistent faith, consistent obedience. And so therefore he says that he's holding fast for the day of Christ. That when Christ comes back, he'll know that his word had an impact on our life, and that had an impact on other people's lives. Right? That's what Paul is doing that for us. He is shining as a star and drawing us in, and we're trying to do that for people today, through our lives, so that in eternity, we're all standing there together. And Paul says, I'm so pleased. He says, I'm so proud. I have joy and gladness about that. All right. We'll pick up in verse 17 next week. Any last thoughts or comments on this section? We'll finish up what Paul says about himself, and then try to move into what he says about Timothy in the next section next week. Thank you very much.